You can build like the strongest digital fortress in the world. You can layer it with AI-driven threat detection, protect it by advanced encryption, and staff it with a 24/7 army of security analysts.
Right, but it really is the ultimate IT paradox.
It really is. Because a single misconfigured clock or a forgotten default setting on a local text console could literally lock your entire company out of its own network.
You can invest millions of dollars at the perimeter to keep attackers out, but if that foundational virtualization layer is even slightly out of alignment, the whole infrastructure just rots from the inside out.
Exactly. And so today, we are taking a stack of technical sources and extracting a complete beginner to advanced study guide for you, focusing on installing, configuring, and critically hardening VMware ESXi.
And since anyone listening to this deep dive already knows VMware ESXi is the bedrock bare metal hypervisor running modern data centers, we really don't need to spend time explaining what virtualization actually is.
Yeah, we can skip the basics. What the architectural breakdowns and security guides really emphasize today is its notoriously tiny disk footprint. Okay, let's unpack this because that tiny footprint isn't just about saving storage space on the server, is it?
Not at all. I mean, that small footprint is an aggressive, intentional security posture.
Right.
When your entire operating system for the virtual infrastructure fits into a few hundred megabytes, you inherently have a drastically reduced attack surface.
Because there's just, well, less code there.
Exactly. There is simply less code to exploit, fewer running background services to hijack, and a much tighter perimeter for your security teams to defend. It is purpose-built to be lean and mathematically secure.
But before we can even talk about locking down that lean hypervisor software, we have to build it on solid physical ground.
Yeah, you need the right foundation.
And there's a genuinely surprising fact in the latest deployment guides for the home lab builders out there.
Oh, about the free version.
Yeah. The free version of VMware ESXi has actually returned. As of version 8.0, update 3, which dropped in April 2025, you can actually go register and download it again.
It is an exciting return for the learning community, definitely. But we do have to temper that enthusiasm with absolute operational reality.
Right, because it's limited.
Very. The free version is strictly for student labs, learning environments, or like very small home setups. It is fundamentally not designed for enterprise production workloads.
Because of the heavy limitations. I'm assuming it strips out the centralized management capabilities.
Precisely. The sources are very clear on what you do not get. You get no vCenter server integration.
So no centralized management at all.
None. That means no vMotion to seamlessly move running virtual machines between physical hosts without downtime, no high availability failover, and no backup storage APIs.
Oh, wow.
On top of that, you are hard capped at 2 physical CPUs per host and 8 virtual CPUs per virtual machine. And, crucially, you get absolutely zero official technical support.
So it's a fantastic sandbox for learning the ropes, but you absolutely would not run a hospital's patient database on it.
Exactly. Now, whether you are building that home lab or a massive production data center, the strict minimum hardware requirements are identical and non-negotiable.
Right, let's go over those.
You need at least 2 physical CPU cores. You need a minimum of 8 gigabytes of physical RAM, though the true production recommendation is 12 gigabytes.
Just to give the system enough breathing room to operate efficiently, right?
Exactly. You must have a gigabit Ethernet controller or faster. And you need a boot disk with at least 32 gigabytes of persistent storage.
Okay, so that boot disk requirement brings up an interesting, almost religious debate in the infrastructure sources.
The USB debate.
Yes. They mentioned that you technically can install VMware ESXi on a standard USB thumb drive.
Technically, yes, you can.
But if we are aiming for enterprise-grade reliability, isn't booting an entire virtualization stack from a thumb drive basically like building a skyscraper on a wooden pallet?
That is a perfect analogy, actually, provided we look closely at exactly why the wood rots.
Right. Okay, explain that.
Well, VMware's own guidance strongly cautions against relying on USB devices for production systems. And it comes down to how the hypervisor operates at a mechanical level.
Because it's constantly writing data.
Exactly. VMware ESXi is constantly writing system logs, diagnostic data, and state changes to its boot drive. Consumer USB flash drives simply do not have the sophisticated wear leveling controllers found in enterprise drives.
So it's exactly like a wooden pallet rotting under the weight. Because there's no wear leveling, the hypervisor just hammers the same flash memory cells over and over until they literally burn out and die.
Exactly. They get physically exhausted, The drive fails, your host crashes, and potentially takes dozens of running virtual machines down with it.
Which is a nightmare. So what is the concrete foundation then? If USBs are out, what are we installing this on for long-term reliability?
Enterprise-grade solid-state drives, or SSDs, strike the best balance of performance and endurance for most standalone or mid-sized environments.
What about larger data centers?
In larger, highly centralized enterprises, you will often see VMware ESXi installed on standalones.
Which basically means slicing up massive centralized storage area networks over fiber optic cables, right?
Right, exactly. Or you'll see them installed on SATA DOMs.
SATA DOMs.
Yeah, SATA DOMs are these highly reliable compact flash modules. They plug directly into the server's motherboard SATA ports, which bypasses traditional drive bays entirely while still providing enterprise endurance.
Got it. Now, the sources also mention auto-deploy. Honestly, the way they describe diskless network booting sounds a bit like magic.
It really is brilliant for massive data centers. Auto-deploy uses the pre-boot execution environment, or PXE boot.
Yeah.
It streams the hypervisor image directly into the physical server's memory over the network every single time it boots.
Wait, so there's literally no local hard drive at all?
None. It allows administrators to roll out identical configurations and security updates across hundreds of hosts simultaneously just by rebooting them.
That sounds incredible, though. Why doesn't everyone just use that?
Because it requires substantial supporting infrastructure. You need highly available DHCP servers, TFTP servers, and pristine network reliability. That makes it massive overkill for smaller deployments.
Which logically leads us to the manual approach.
Yeah.
If you're setting up a smaller environment or an edge location, the sources advocate heavily for the interactive installation.
Yes, the manual interactive install.
Now, I always thought of manual installs as just mindlessly clicking next through a wizard until a progress bar finishes.
A lot of people do think that.
But there's a real strategic reason to do it manually, isn't there?
There is. It is much more than a wizard. In a scenario where you are deploying a modest environment, avoiding the heavy architectural overhead of complex automation tools is a deliberate, smart choice.
Right.
The interactive install provides total visibility. You are actively verifying the disk selection, confirming the hardware is recognized, and selecting the keyboard layout.
Which matters immensely when you're typing complex passwords.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You are ensuring nothing is misconfigured silently in the background by a script.
The sources also highlight it as a vital knowledge transfer tool for junior staff.
Yes, it forces the systems administrator to understand the why behind each architectural choice. Furthermore, if you are dealing with quirky, repurposed, or heavily customized hardware, an interactive install allows you to adapt to strange storage controller or network driver issues on the fly.
That makes sense.
And perhaps most importantly, from a strict security standpoint, it allows the administrator to manually set a highly secure root password directly on the physical machine before it ever touches an active, potentially hostile network.
So setting that root password manually ensures it is secure from day one. But once you've typed that password in on the server room floor, how do you manage this machine before it even has an IP address?
Because you can't reach it over the network yet.
Right. That is where you have to rely on the local interface.
You are stepping into the physical command center.
Enter the DCUI, the Direct Console User Interface. You walk up to the physical server, plug in a crash cart monitor and keyboard, and the screen lights up with that unmistakable stark yellow and gray interface.
Yeah, you press F2 and you are in.
It's described as this low-level, text-based lifeline. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources highlight the DCUI as the ultimate disaster recovery tool.
It intentionally strips away all the modern graphical abstraction. It is a control panel for stability and operational readiness that does not rely on remote access, network connectivity, or external software tools. It is the raw, unfiltered interface between the administrator and the host.
Imagine a remote admin is trying to optimize network traffic. They accidentally misconfigure a virtual LAN tag, say, typing VLAN 10 instead of VLAN 100, and they instantly orphan the management interface from the rest of the network switch. Exactly. Boom. The host drops completely off the management network. vCenter can't see it. Secure Shell or SSH remote access is completely dead.
In a fully remote setup without out-of-band management, you would be looking at a forced hard reboot or a catastrophic prolonged outage.
But with the DCUI, a local admin can simply walk into the server room, authenticate by pressing F2, navigate directly to the network restore options, and reconfigure that management network interface.
They strip the bad VLAN tag and bring the host back online without ever restarting the underlying server or interrupting the virtual machines that are still running perfectly fine on their own isolated networks. That is true operational resilience.
It's also where you manage the most dangerous credentials on the entire system.
The root password.
Right. The root account holds the absolute keys to the kingdom. It has unfiltered access to host configuration, system logs, storage data stores, literally everything.
During that interactive install we discussed, you set the root password initially, but managing it long-term happens right there in the DCUI under the Configure Password menu.
And mishandling that root password isn't just a theoretical textbook risk. The sources outline a deeply chilling real-world example.
The early 2023 ESXi ransomware attacks.
Yeah.
That was a devastating global wave of attacks. Hackers targeted thousands of VMware ESXi servers. What is critical to understand is that they didn't just use highly sophisticated zero-day exploits.
No, they heavily leveraged incredibly poor credential hygiene. They looked for unchanged or easily guessable root passwords on older servers, didn't they?
Exactly. Organizations had left older, unpatched versions of the hypervisor running, often with default or severely weak configurations.
Oh.
The attackers gained root access, systematically encrypted the virtual machine files stored on those hosts, and left ransom notes. Hospitals, universities, and small businesses were severely disrupted, entirely locked out of their critical data.
It proved definitively that root access is not just a login.
No, it is a massive liability if mishandled.
Hold on, though. If the DCUI gives you the absolute keys to the kingdom to fix networks and change passwords, aren't we just moving the vulnerability?
How do you mean?
Well, if anyone can literally walk up to the keyboard and press F2, isn't the physical server itself our biggest weak point?
This raises an important question, right, about the balance of physical versus remote security. You are completely right to call that out.
Okay.
The DCUI provides a specific option called Reset System Configuration. It is designed as a nuclear option to revert the host to its software defaults and wipe out custom network settings or packages if the system is irreparably corrupted.
Right, a factory reset, basically.
But here is the terrifying detail from the text. Executing that reset also completely deletes the root password.
Wait, it doesn't revert to a default password. It just wipes it blank.
It resets it entirely to blank.
Oh my God.
If you reset a host via the DCUI and do not immediately go back in and resecure it with a new password, you've just handed total unrestricted control to absolutely anyone with physical or network access to that machine.
That is terrifying.
It is, and this is exactly why the physical security of your server room is the strictly necessary counterbalance to your remote access lockdowns. The DCUI is an emergency toolkit. Every single action taken there should be intentional, auditable, and physically protected by a locked door, badge readers, and strict physical access controls.
All right, so we've bolted the physical door, we've got our bare metal hardware sorted, the interactive install is clean, and the root password is locked down tight in the DCUI.
Sounds pretty secure so far.
It does. But the security guides reveal this invisible, silent threat that can destroy your entire domain from the inside, even if your passwords and physical security are absolutely perfect. Time drift.
Time synchronization. It is, without question, the most overlooked foundational control in virtualization.
The sources share this gripping story about a Kerberos catastrophe.
Oh, yeah.
A mid-sized organization running a sprawling Windows domain suddenly starts experiencing massive login failures. Users are completely locked out, enterprise applications are throwing bizarre authentication errors, and the IT team is spending weeks chasing ghosts.
Looking for advanced malware or failing hardware.
Exactly. And the true culprit was just a few minutes of time drift on their underlying VMware ESXi hosts.
Right. It's wild how much damage that can do.
But what I want to understand is why time drift is such a uniquely terrible problem in a virtualized environment. With physical servers, a clock drifts maybe a few seconds a month, which isn't a huge deal.
No, but in a hypervisor, it can be much faster and way more erratic.
Why is that?
Because virtual machines do not have physical hardware clocks of their own. They rely entirely on the host's physical CPU for clock cycles.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so if the VMware ESXi host is under heavy computational load, the virtual CPUs can literally skip beats.
Skip beats, like they just miss a clock cycle.
Exactly. The virtual clocks start drifting wildly. And when you are dealing with Kerberos authentication, which Active Directory relies on, timestamps are used to prevent replay attacks.
Right, the client ticket timestamp must absolutely be within a strict 5-minute window compared to the server.
Exactly. So if the hypervisor's clock drifts past that 5-minute window, it drags the domain controllers running on it out of sync.
The timestamps are rejected as fraudulent.
And the domain trust literally breaks apart.
That is insane. And the critical operational oversight in that specific story stems from a very common misconception, doesn't it?
Yes. Administrators frequently assume that because their central vCenter server is synced to the correct time, the individual VMware ESXi hosts managed by vCenter will automatically inherit that accurate time.
But they don't.
They do not. VMware ESX hosts must be explicitly and individually configured to synchronize with a reliable external time source. Without that explicit configuration, the hosts drift, the virtual machines drift, and your infrastructure collapses.
Which means databases corrupt data due to out-of-order writes, financial transactions fail compliance checks, and your security audit logs become practically useless.
Exactly.
So how do we fix it and prevent that drift? The sources break down two main protocols for keeping the host's clock accurate: NTP and PTP. I know NTP is the standard, but how do they actually differ under the hood?
Let's break them down. NTP stands for Network Time Protocol. It operates on UDP port 123.
Okay.
It is a highly robust client-server protocol that synchronizes your host by constantly polling a public source, like a government time server or an internal domain controller.
And NTP gives you millisecond accuracy, which the sources say is perfectly fine for 99% of standard workloads.
Yes, millisecond-level accuracy is perfectly sufficient to prevent Kerberos failures, maintain general domain trust, and keep standard enterprise logging accurate.
But what if I am running a high-frequency traded platform where every microsecond dictates millions of dollars, or like a massive scientific simulation?
That is when you must move to PTP, the Precision Time Protocol.
Okay, how does that work?
PTP operates on UDP ports 319 and 320. Instead of millisecond accuracy, it provides microsecond-level precision. But here's the critical mechanism. To truly leverage PTP, you have to utilize hardware timestamping.
Meaning the software operating system isn't even handling the clock updates anymore.
Exactly. You use specific high-end network interface cards like the Intel X710 or E810 series and configure them using a feature called PCI pass-through.
Oh, wow.
This allows the network card itself to process the time packets at the hardware level, completely bypassing the software operating system overhead. It eliminates the latency of the hypervisor processing the network traffic.
That is incredibly precise.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, accurate time isn't just about troubleshooting a frustrating login error. It is a strict legal and security imperative.
How so?
Imagine you suffer a sophisticated data breach. If your log timestamps are drifting by 10 minutes across different servers and firewalls, you physically cannot reconstruct the attack chain. You won't know which event happened first. Accurate time proves due diligence in a legal audit. It is the absolute bedrock of operational trust.
All right, so we've got the hardware sorted, the physical access locked down via the DCUI, and the time perfectly synced via NTP or PTP to dodge those Kerberos failures.
You're in good shape.
We are. But a host isn't an island. The second we plug this hardened box into the broader corporate network, the threat model completely changes. We have to scale our security.
Right, because the moment that network cable is connected, the VMware ESXi host becomes a prime target for lateral movement within the network.
Which is why the built-in firewall is so crucial. The sources note you can find its configuration under the host settings, then configure system and firewall. What I love is that it is highly restrictive by default. It inherently blocks incoming remote clients and unauthorized outbound connections.
It operates strictly on the principle of least privilege. You only open the specific ports that are absolutely necessary for operation.
Right.
For example, you might only allow SSH traffic from a specific, highly monitored administrative jumpbox subnet, or allow UDP port 123 out to your designated internal NTP servers. Everything else is dropped by the hypervisor kernel before it can even be processed.
Now, when it comes to actually managing the system day to day, I can see how a lot of smaller IT teams might be tempted to just create a bunch of local user accounts directly on the host for their staff.
Oh, boy.
You know, Bob gets a local account, Sarah gets a local account, the new intern gets one.
I vehemently advise against that, and the security guides are universally clear on the extreme danger of local accounts.
If local accounts are a nightmare, I'm assuming the only sane way to manage this at scale is tying it into something centralized, like Active Directory.
Exactly.
But why are those local accounts so dangerous to begin with?
Because local accounts create completely isolated identity silos. They are massive administrative blind spots. Think about the mechanism. Local accounts are difficult to track, almost impossible to audit centrally for failed login attempts, and highly prone to privilege creep.
Privilege creep, right?
If an employee changes roles, say, moving from a systems administrator to a developer, someone has to remember to manually log into every single host and delete or modify that local account.
Which never happens.
Never. When you transition from one standalone host to a centralized environment with 50 hosts, managing those local accounts is an operational nightmare that always leads to abandoned, vulnerable credentials.
So joining the VMware ESXi host to your Active Directory domain completely solves that.
It shifts the entire authentication burden to your centralized, heavily monitored identity provider.
So Bob and Sarah just log in with their normal corporate domain credential.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And more importantly, it enables role-based access control, or RBAC. You do not give Bob the root password. You assign an Active Directory group, say ESA admins, the necessary privileges on the host. If Bob leaves the company, his Active Directory account is disabled by HR, and his access to the hypervisor is instantaneously revoked across the entire global infrastructure. No manual cleanup required.
That is so much cleaner and safer. And it leads perfectly into the ultimate security feature mentioned in the architectural breakdowns, which is lockdown mode.
Lockdown mode is the definitive final step in hardening the host.
Okay, how does it work?
When you enable lockdown mode, it completely disables direct remote access for the root account. Even if a highly sophisticated attacker somehow compromises the root password, they cannot use SSH or the web interface to log directly into that specific host over the network.
Because all remote management traffic is forced to pass through the centralized vCenter server.
Correct. By forcing all management through vCenter, every single action is governed by those strict Active Directory permissions we just talked about, and every single click is centrally audited.
So if lockdown mode is on, the only backdoor to manage the host directly is walking physically up to the server room and using the DCUI.
That is the only way in.
So what does this all mean? It seems like by moving away from local accounts, integrating with Active Directory, and flipping the switch on lockdown mode, you aren't just ticking compliance boxes on a generic security audit.
No, not at all.
You are building a permanent legacy of clarity, consistency, and control. You are actively replacing a messy patchwork of ad hoc exceptions with a unified, tightly engineered security posture.
You are engineering an environment where trust is constantly verified, every point of access is auditable, and the infrastructure fundamentally defends itself by design.
It is a massive journey, and we've covered the entire blueprint today.
We really have.
We started talking about picking resilient, enterprise-grade SSDs and SATA DOMs over fragile USB drives to prevent hardware rot. We walked up to the physical server and navigated the text-based DCUI to set static IPs, understanding why that physical interface is the ultimate disaster recovery lifeline. We unpacked the mechanics of time drift, seeing exactly how CPU scheduling anomalies can shatter Kerberos authentication unless you deploy NTP or PTP. And finally, we scaled our security by abandoning dangerous local accounts for Active Directory role-based access control, sealing the host shut with lockdown mode.
It is a highly comprehensive framework for true resilience, but, as with all complex interwoven systems, solving one architectural problem often reveals a completely new puzzle.
Oh, what are we missing?
Think back to the very beginning of our discussion. We noted that the newly returned free version of VMware ESXi 8.0 Update 3 specifically lacks vCenter server integration.
Right. It's strictly a standalone, isolated setup.
And we just established that lockdown mode, arguably the single most powerful software tool to secure a host against remote attacks, strictly requires vCenter server to function.
Oh, wow.
So if you are running a small standalone edge deployment on that free tier, how do you truly protect a critical system when your strongest digital padlock isn't even available to you? It is a critical architecture question you will have to solve for your next lab build.
That is a brilliant, slightly terrifying puzzle to leave everyone with. A fortress with a missing padlock. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning your infrastructure, check your clocks, and we'll see you next time.